Hello, I'm Kamal Santamaria. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and finance. This week, Argentina, Spain, and the oil. Cristina Kirchner strikes a populist note, trying to seize control of Argentina's biggest oil company. But its Spanish owners are furious, and it sparked more than a business dispute. Also, the International Monetary Fund, its outlook on the Eurozone, bailouts, and China. We hear from the group's chief economist. And 2 years on since the world's worst oil disaster, we go back to the Gulf of Mexico to count the continuing cost wrought on the ocean, the environment, and the people. But we start with the stoush between Argentina and Spain over oil, specifically the oil company YPF, a 90-year-old Argentine institution which Argentina's president wants back under 51% local control. But its majority owners are Spanish, a group called Repsol, and they are none too pleased about all of this. We'll outline that a little later, what has essentially turned into a diplomatic incident, but we want to start with the Argentine argument, the damage they say Repsol has done to YPF since it took control back in the late 90s. The hard oil numbers first. Argentinian oil reserves, they fell 18% between 1998 and 2010, according to the Argentine Oil and Gas Institute. All told, Repsol is accused of being responsible for 54% of the decline in petroleum reserves. And there's a value decline too. YPF's market value's fallen about 25%, and we're just talking this year alone. There's also a need for investment. There are oil shale fields all ready to exploit, but it'll need $25 billion a year to tap into that. Now, just so you know the way the ownership currently stands, let's put this in some context first of all. Back in 1999, Repsol took 98% of YPF. Over the years, though, that holding has declined to 58%, though that is clearly still a majority. Argentina retains 26%, the rest is in the hands of private owners. But under this 51% seizure plan, the Argentine government will own about 29% of YPF. Argentina's 23 provinces and the city of Buenos Aires will own 28% of the company. Repsol, remember it once held 98%, will be left with just 6% under this deal. But there may be more to all of this as well. A further 25% of YPF is owned by the Peterson Group. This is run by Argentina's billionaire Eskenazi family. And this drama could all have a lot more to do with Fernandez falling out with the Eskenazis, because it was Mrs. Fernandez's late husband, Nestor Kirchner, who actually helped the Eskenazis buy their stake. But the money for that stake was loaned by Repsol. So think about it. If there is a public seizure of YPF from Repsol, that could lead to the Eskenazis defaulting on their own payments, leaving them in some serious trouble. Now, as far as consequences go, there are a few things to think about here. One, does Argentina have the capacity to do this in the first place? Nationalist fervour, it's enthusiastic, sure. Doesn't pay bills, though. Two, what will all of this do to Argentine-Spanish relations? And three, and this is what we're actually going to see in our report now from Teresa Bo, what actually went wrong in the first place?
These oil wells are at the center of a conflict between Spain and Argentina. For almost 20 years, Argentina's oil company, YPF, has been controlled by the Spanish oil giant Repsol. Congress is currently debating a bill passed by the government to take over 51% of the company. The government's move has been expected for a while, especially in oil-producing provinces like Chubut, where many believe the company failed to invest in oil and gas projects.
They have not invested in anything, not in exploration or in increasing our natural resources. They only extracted the oil that was already there. That's why the president is doing this.
Oil production has dropped over 30% since the company was privatized back in the 1990s, forcing the government to import all sorts of energy. Argentines have gotten used to shortages of fuel and gas, and many here are wondering the impact that this announcement is going to have in their lives. Daniel Montamat is the former Secretary of Energy. He says Cristina Kirchner is trying to put the blame of the government's energy failures on Repsol.
The problem is that the energy problem is complicating the country's economy because it had to spend over $10 billion to import energy, and that affects the commercial scale. Instead of trying to find solutions, the government is finding someone to blame.
Governor Martín Bussi from Chubut was one of those backing the central government's decision. Oil-producing provinces like Chubut would benefit with some of the expropriated shares. He says the national government is getting ready to do the investment that he claims Repsol has failed to do.
It will take 3 years of at least $4 billion a year in investment in order to recover the production we had 20 years ago. It will take at least 10 years to be where we were. We all know that a company can be destroyed very quickly, but to put it back on its feet may take time.
Argentina has some of the world's largest reserves of non-conventional oil and gas. That's hydrocarbons that are trapped deep underground. So the country needs billions of dollars in investment in order to be able to extract it. But some people worry that the government's move will just scare off private companies.
When there is uncertainty, there is a decrease in investment and exploration. To extract non-conventional hydrocarbons, you need technology. Because it's difficult to extract them, it takes time, effort and money, and you need a long-term vision in the sector.
Argentinians generally support the government's plan, but the aggressive way it's been done and the final costs are already raising concerns.
This is another example of the Kirchner's failure, and it will send a terrible message to the world. We will have a serious confrontation with Spain, and we will continue to show that Argentina is a place where investment is punished.
Argentina will have to pay Repsol billions in compensation, but the exact figure will surely become another point of dispute. Teresa Bo, Al Jazeera, Buenos Aires.
All right, let's go to London now for a bit of analysis on this story. Latin America analyst Lawrence Allen joining us from IHS Global Insight. And Lawrence, it's a real mess at the moment on a diplomatic level, on a business level, all these sorts of things. Your thoughts, first of all, on what is actually behind why Cristina Kirchner is doing this? I know there are a lot of varying reasons, but what do you think is behind the big push?
Well, Kamala, what Cristina Kirchner is saying, what the Argentine government are saying, is that this is purely about energy self-sufficiency, about falling levels of oil production in particular in Argentina, and consequently about rising energy import bills. They view this not only as a problem in kind of practical energy terms, but also in some way as a kind of threat to their national sovereignty. So there's on the one hand the economic, on the other hand this kind of rather sensitive issue around fuel energy sovereignty, if you like.
Okay, let's stay with that Argentine perspective for a moment. Are they actually in a position to do this? Got to find the money to obviously take this controlling stake and then move towards this long-term goal you say of being energy self-sufficient. I'm questioning, is Argentina in a position to actually do this?
Well, most analysts, and I think we at IHS Global Insight are in agreement here, is most analysts' view is that the Argentine government faces a potential fiscal crunch within the next 12 months. There's certainly evidence that their economic growth, which has been very strong in recent years, is going to slow down this year. That indicates that the government could struggle to raise the funds itself, to invest and to keep the energy industry ticking over, indeed to expand production. And of course the move that they've made expropriating Repsol's share of YPF will not help attract outward investment.
And then on the flip side, what do you make of the Spanish reaction? It's been, reading some of the comments and the recalling of the ambassador and these sorts of reactions, they almost seem to be taking it Spanish personally and are looking for, I think it is $10 billion in compensation. Again, what do you think is behind what seems to be a very strong Spanish reaction?
That's correct. Antonio Brufau, the chairman of Repsol, has said that they will be looking for $10 billion in compensation. I think that this partially is a direct response to the fact that actually the YPF share is very important to Repsol as it is, and that Repsol is itself a very important motor in the Spanish economy. Given the condition that the Spanish economy is in at the moment, that of course has particular significance, and obviously Repsol have been able to get the Spanish government on side with them in attempting to pressure the Argentine government into coming to some sort of reasonable arrangement over compensation. I must say that I don't hold out any great hopes that that's going to be resolved swiftly. That's partially because Argentina doesn't have a particularly good track record in terms of international arbitration over such issues. It's also partially because the Argentine Vice Minister of Economy said quite clearly on Tuesday that $10 billion was not going to be a sum the Argentine government would pay in compensation.
Yeah, but do you think Repsol does have a case to answer here? Could the Argentinians' argument where they're saying, look, since you took over, reserves and production have gone down, you haven't sunk the money back into the company and you haven't put it back into new exploration work, does that hold water? Do they have a case to answer, basically?
Well, it's possible that Repsol have a case to answer here. It's also something that's not actually been mentioned that much, certainly in Argentina, is that, of course, although Repsol have had a major share in the largest energy company in Argentina and thus logically should probably be examined to some extent, the Argentine government itself has set the conditions for the way that these companies operate. So the current government of Cristina Fernández de Kirchner also has some level of responsibility, and there are other actors from different international energy companies who are also operational in Argentina. So this isn't simply a question about Repsol or YPF indeed, it's a wider question.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that because I do want to widen this out anyway to some of the other investors. One of them, the Peterson Group. We mentioned this before. It's run by the billionaire Argentinian family, the Eskenazis. As we understand it, they took out a loan from Repsol to buy their stake in YPF, and there is this suggestion now that this is actually another part of the argument, that there's been a falling out between the Argentinians, between the government and the Eskenazis, and that Cristina Kirchner is as much trying to get them out of the picture as she is trying to move Repsol out. What do you make of all of that?
Well, it seems quite clear that when the Peterson Group became involved in YPF, now going back a couple of years, that there were quite warm relations between them and the Fernández de Kirchner government. What we're led to believe, those relations have become rather strained in recent months. However, the actual government intention with regard to the Peterson Group is extremely unclear. Likewise, the financial arrangements between Repsol and Peterson is not entirely clear yet. It's obviously an issue that's going to run and quite a lot of questions are being asked inside Argentina about why the Peterson Group itself was not the target of the same sort of pressure as Repsol was.
There's still lots to play for, isn't there? Lawrence Allen joining us from IHS Global Insight. Thank you, Lawrence.
Indeed.
And still ahead this week on Counting the Cost, the ecological, the economic losses from the world's worst oil spill. 2 years after Deepwater Horizon, there is movement on the compensation front, but what about BP's big cleanup? We are back in the Gulf of Mexico a little later in this program. Right now, though, we are going broad brush. The twice-yearly World Economic Outlook report from the International Monetary Fund, the kind of thing economists and politicians wait for and certainly pay attention to. The conclusion, well, things are fragile, not necessarily bad, but the recovery from all the economic shocks of the last few years is clearly a delicate one. Good news first, the IMF did raise its global economic forecast, predicting 3.5% growth, which is slightly higher than its previous prediction. The Eurozone, though, is expected to go through a mild recession, contracting 0.3% this year, not the previous 0.5%, though, we should say. And the United States, long-time global economic powerhouse, is expected to grow 2.1%, which is also up from 1.8%, the type of thing Barack Obama definitely wants to hear in an election year. John Terrett, one of our Washington correspondents, sat down with the IMF's chief economist, Olivier Blanchard, to discuss the report, possible bailout for Spain, prospects for China and Brazil too. But he began with the specific dangers to the world economy.
The dangers are clearly of another flare-up in Europe. But even if we leave this aside, and our forecasts assume this will not happen on a major scale, we don't, as you've seen, we don't forecast very high growth. In a way, one should be surprised because you have, in advanced economies, you have an interest rate which is very close to zero, even zero in some places. And you tend to think at 0%, how can it be that people are not borrowing like crazy, firms investing and so on? So the reason why the growth forecasts are fairly low is twofold. Basically, there's fiscal consolidation. It's needed, but it's affecting growth in the short run. We know that. There is no free lunch here. Basically, you have to do it, but it slows down demand. And the other is bank deleveraging. We think banks were doing too much. They have to become smaller. The issue is that bank deleveraging may lead to tight credit. and in some places, in Europe in particular, we see tight credit. So you have these two breaks. The result is, low growth forecast.
Let's come back to Europe in just a second. But what about geopolitical issues? And here I'm thinking in particular of Iran and the threat to fuel prices and trade routes being interrupted. How much of a problem is that right now?
Well, it is surely one of the risks. I would say the major risk is still Europe,
right.
But the second major risk is geopolitical uncertainty. The problem is it can take many forms, right? You can have a problem in Iran, you can have the closing of the Straits of Hormuz. Closing of the Straits of Hormuz would probably be an event which would increase the price very, very much, but fairly quickly ships would be rerouted, the price would come down. There's a scenario in which there is just ongoing uncertainty in the Middle East, and the price of oil remains high. So we have looked at various scenarios, one in which the price of oil increases by 50% and remains roughly at 50% for a number of years. That would take, in advanced countries, maybe 1%, 1.5% output. So this is over 2 years, so a bit less than 1% growth each year. If you think in addition that the governments will not be able to help in this case because fiscally they have little space, then the effect would be worse, and then you get to larger numbers. So if this happened, starting from the baseline, which is not a very good one, we could easily get very close to zero.
So as a result, you have very low growth forecasts, particularly even for advanced nations in Europe like France and Germany. There is a sense in the world that a second shoe has yet to drop, that there's another big issue that hasn't happened yet, but must happen before the global economy can really start growing again. Do you agree with that?
I wish there were only two shoes, because when the second has dropped, we would know that that's it. I think it's not the right analogy. I think there are many shoes which can drop. If you look, it is an illusion to think that we can solve the European crisis like that. The countries in the Euro periphery have a really tough job. So even if they do everything right and they get help, it's still the case that they have a fiscal problem, they have a competitiveness problem, they have a growth problem. And so I think we have to be ready for the fact that along the way, something is going to go a bit wrong. Then the investors are going to worry. They are going to push yields up. It's going to be very difficult for the country to borrow. And I'm quite sure we'll see a number of episodes like this. So these are the many shoes. What we have to do is to make sure that when the shoe drops, it's not an earthquake. The shoe drops, but we handle it. So that's where policy measures need to be taken.
Well, as you say, there's a strong fiscal package in place by the European Union with the backing of the ECB. If the shoe does drop, and it is in Europe, will the IMF step in? Will the IMF come in with a bailout package?
It's possible. Our general principle is that we're always there to help members. So just to take a theoretical example, if one of these countries was taking the measures that we think are the right measures, or was willing to take them, but investors had doubts, we could clearly, as we've done in many cases, go in and provide funds at a lower rate. This is where the so-called firewalls could be used.
And how worried is the IMF seeing bond yields in Spain just this week going above 6%? That's a problem for people who have to pay out on that. Is that sustainable, and does that really worry you?
This is what I've talked about before, which is that for one reason or another, and nothing dramatic happened in Spain in the last week, investors get skittish and they get out. And then the question is, well, can the government finance itself at this new higher rate? And there's clearly a vicious cycle in which, if for any reason the investors land at 15%, then no government can basically sustain its budget. So this is the case in which we need tools to make sure that, again, if the governments are doing their part, which they are, right, then they can borrow at a reasonable rate. Could be us, could be the ECB, could be the EU, could be a combination of them. But that's what's needed.
Let's look at some other regions in the world. China in particular, you're forecasting a growth rate for 2012 of 8.2%.
Right.
The Chinese have said that they could live with 7.5% growth, which is well down from what it has been. Do you think they could?
Sure, they can.
Without risking instability?
Yes, I think that it's clear that the days of 10% more growth are gone. There's a change in the composition of production, which is such that productivity growth will be lower. So I do not know whether 7.5 is the right number or 8 is the right number, but I think now for China, we have to be in a mode in which 8% is a reasonable goal.
And if it is 8.2%, which you're forecasting, how much does that dent the United States argument that the yuan is undervalued?
Well, that's not directly related. What's more directly related is what happens to the current account. And as you know, the current account has considerably reduced. The current account surplus has considerably reduced. The issue there is it's cyclical because the exports to advanced countries have gone down, and will it go up again, or is it structural? And our analysis is that it's partly cyclical, partly structural. So we don't expect current account surpluses to go back to the 10% of 2007. So there we think that there has been a structural change in China, which is good, and therefore that goes in the right direction without any question.
Olivier Blanchard there from the IMF. Now, it's kind of hard to believe, but it has just ticked past 2 years since the explosion at BP's Deepwater Horizon rig in the Gulf of Mexico, which means it's 2 years since 11 people lost their lives, since more than 4 million barrels of oil were spilled into the sea, and since an extraordinary number of compensation claims were opened up as well. In fact, it's taken those 2 years for BP to agree to pay $7.8 billion to resolve economic, property and medical claims for more than 100,000 individuals and businesses. But it still faces tens of billions of claims, with its potential liability for violating the Clean Water Act up at $17.6 billion. So obviously BP's had to set some money aside for all of this. Last count, it was up at $37.2 billion. But according to local fishermen and regional scientists, catches are down as much as 90% in areas directly impacted by the oil spill, which leaves those fishermen hanging on to their economic lives. Dara Jamail examines now how the crisis has affected them.
Just 30 sacks of oysters, when at least for Brad Robin, the catch should normally be 1,000. And it's been like this since the disaster. That's 2 years he has been facing economic ruin.
I mean, the truth of the matter, it's not there to catch. We can't catch it. It's terrible. It's disaster's an understatement for what they have done.
These boats are at dock when they normally should be out fishing during one of the busiest times of the year. Despite efforts by state and federal governments, along with BP to convince everyone that the fishing industry has recovered, people here are telling us a different story. Half of all oysters sold in the U.S. used to come from Louisiana's waters. Fishermen now supply just 1/5. And it's not just oysters that are in decline.
I've never seen this before. That's one of the best winter fisheries in North America, in Buras, Louisiana. And I didn't catch one speckled trout for 3 months.
If you live in this part of Louisiana, this is what the neighborhood looks like. For generations, lives and livelihoods have revolved around the marshes and fisheries. So it can be hard for people to talk openly about what's happened since the spill. But Ryan Lambert will.
But as of last May, the speckled trout, which is 90% of my fish that we catch, have moved out. You know, I've seen high rivers, I've seen low rivers, I've seen algae blooms, I've seen dead zone, I've seen it all. I've been 31 years in the business, but I've never seen no speckled trout, ever.
Meanwhile, the oyster industry is in dramatic decline. Shrimp catches are down as much as 80% in some areas.
These people down here are hurting. We're hurting. I'm not afraid to go to court with BP because it's a proof. They destroyed my industry. They destroyed my livelihood, they destroyed my business, and they also destroyed the way we did life.
And many have gone to court. There are tens of thousands of cases, billions of dollars at stake. But when it comes to fishermen, BP is taking a tough line, limiting the amount it will pay.
I was born here. I'm still here, and so is BP.
The public message is that everything and everyone will be looked after. But Brad Robin wonders how much longer he can last. Dar Jamail, Al Jazeera, New Orleans.
And that is where we'll leave you for this week. But if you want to get in touch, here's how you do it. Either send a tweet to me at KamalAJE or our business editor at Abid Oliver Ali. And if you're not on Twitter, just drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. While you're online, please head over to aljazeera.com/business. Link to the CTC page. That is where we put all our episodes up in full for you to catch up on. One more note, I'm off duty for a little while, so Matt Moore will be looking after you while I'm away. Make sure you join him for next week's show. But that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Kamal Santamaria from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.